A nation brought to a near standstill by an airline that prides itself on connecting the country. With slogans like India by IndiGo and On Time All the Time, and a mission statement that reads giving wings to the nation by connecting people and aspirations. And an unprecedented event where that philosophy faltered, leaving nearly 1 million passengers across the country stranded, and bringing into question its built-for-efficiency way of working.
To be suddenly faced with the fact that the country's largest airline pretty much shuts down for the best part of 2 days and thousands of flights get cancelled. Nobody's ever dealt with that before.
On certain days, 2/3 of IndiGo's flights getting cancelled. Totally unheard of.
On this episode of Business Beyond, we look at how a disruption at a single airline snowballed into a full-fledged national aviation crisis, and try and uncover what it reveals about the dangers a duopoly poses to India's aviation industry. For context, let's give you a quick primer on IndiGo. It's India's largest airline by some margin, with over 60% domestic market share. Its nearest competitor is the Air India group, which isn't a close second. The other airlines, they're fighting for a really tiny piece of the pie. As things currently stand, the aviation business in India really is a duopoly. Some people even say it's an effective monopoly, but more on that later. IndiGo has a fleet of around 440 aircraft and typically operates over 2,200 flights every single day. Each month it carries almost 9 million passengers across India, which translates to an annual figure of well over 100 million passengers. Which is why when things went wrong at the beginning of December 2025, with an out-of-the-ordinary number of flight cancellations over the course of several days, it effectively grounded the country. To put things into perspective, India is huge, roughly 9 times the size of Germany, where air travel really is the quickest option. A flight from Bengaluru in the south to the capital city of New Delhi in the north takes just under 3 hours. A train journey between the two cities takes a minimum of 32 hours. Official reasons cited for the flight cancellations pointed to a combination of factors, the most significant of which were the revised flight duty time limitations, or FDTL norms, regulations that define work hours and mandatory rest periods to ensure aircraft crew don't suffer from fatigue. But we'll delve into the nitty-gritty of FDTL norms later on in the piece. For now, to really understand how significant an airline IndiGo is, we need to take a trip back to 2006, when the landscape of Indian aviation looked very different. See, when the first ever IndiGo flight operated in August 2006, going from New Delhi to Guwahati and then on to Imphal, the Indian air traveller was spoilt for choice. There were the old established airlines, Air India and Indian Airlines. Then there were airlines established in the early 90s, Air Sahara and more importantly Jet Airways, the market leader at the time. Kingfisher Airlines was Indian businessman Vijay Mallya's attempt to make domestic air travel a luxurious affair, while Air Deccan was the country's first truly low-cost, no-frills carrier. SpiceJet and Go Air were newer low-cost outfits. In the 2 decades since then, effectively only 3 of those airlines from that time survive, with IndiGo emerging as the strongest of them all. Why did a relatively late entrant to the Indian aviation space succeed while so many other established airlines failed in the cost-intensive, incredibly difficult-to-sustain business? The answer lies in the philosophy of IndiGo's co-founders Rakesh Gangwal and Rahul Bhatia. To find out more about IndiGo's early years, we turn to Captain Shakti Lumba, former Vice President of Flight Operations at the airline and one of the early members of IndiGo's core team, who details his journey with the airline in his book The Old Bold Pilot. In a written interview with DW's Business Beyond, Captain Lumba said of IndiGo's foundational years,
"The IndiGo startup was done by experienced professional teams tasked with laying the foundation for a profitable, low-cost carrier in which cost control was of paramount importance. The organization structure was flat for quick decision-making and conflict resolution."
What also worked to IndiGo's advantage? The slow collapse of other airlines. Kingfisher, which had acquired Air Deccan, began suffering the consequences of poor financial decisions and the recession of 2008. More recently, in April 2019, Jet Airways suffered a similar fate thanks in part to its acquisition of Air Sahara. And in 2023, Go Air or Go First became the latest significant airline to fold. As Captain Loomba says,
IndiGo, with its increasing fleet size, took advantage of the airport slots that became available and rapidly filled the gap opened by the closure of these two airlines. Its market share and profitability increased because of the expansion opportunities that fell in its lap. Can anyone really blame IndiGo for its profits and market share resulting in an almost monopoly?
Which isn't to say that IndiGo's success was only to do with the failure of other airlines. In fact, as someone used to flying IndiGo, most recently in 2023 while on assignment for Deutsche Welle, I've largely had good experiences on the airline. The airplanes were clean, had food for purchase on board, and they did a good job of branding themselves. If you've flown domestically in India, there's a good chance you have one of IndiGo's famous nutcases at home. But more than anything else, they were known for their extreme levels of efficiency, an airline that was almost unfailingly punctual. Pablo Chatterjee is an automotive journalist and travel writer and one of the many Indians caught out by IndiGo's flight cancellations in December 2025. And he corroborates what I've said.
I think that was part of the reason that so many people were so disappointed with what IndiGo did, which is that their track record having been so good of being largely on time and running a slick operation and being customer friendly, focused on the customer's needs more or less, that all came crashing down in 3 days' time.
If you were watching the news or were on social media around the beginning of December 2025, you probably got a glimpse into exactly how things came crashing down. There were videos of irate passengers stranded at airports across the country, of ground staff trying to keep the situation in control but not really succeeding. Chatterjee had first-hand experience of the affair when his direct flight from Chandigarh to Goa was cancelled.
I turned around to the counter and there were roughly 300 people at that counter, all yelling and screaming. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think I saw somebody trying to use another human being as a sort of ladder to climb over to be able to get in their query first. So that was never going to happen.
What should have been a 2-hour, 50-minute direct flight ended up involving one extra night at a hotel in Chandigarh, a road trip from Chandigarh to New Delhi, a flight from New Delhi to Mumbai, a night at the airport in Mumbai, and finally a flight back to Goa.
We got to Bombay at about 10:30, I think, at night. And then as we got out of the plane and into the baggage area, there were mounds of luggage just piled everywhere. But I've never seen that before. The luggage just sort of literally lying all over the place. I have no idea, whether people got their luggage back later or not.
Lost luggage and crowds and mayhem at the airports aside, there was a clear financial impact felt by passengers. Those who'd had their flights cancelled were scrambling to try and get refunds online with varying amounts of success. And they needed to shell out significant amounts of money to arrange alternative modes of transportation.
Other airlines immediately took advantage of all this and jacked up their prices. I mean, there were people who were paying a lakh of rupees to fly one way within the country. It went in from capitalism to price gouging pretty quickly. The government, I think, woke up fairly late and put in some measures and said that, okay, for a certain number of kilometers, you can only charge so much.
Which brings us back to why. Like we said earlier, IndiGo officially stated that it was a combination of factors that led to the flight cancellation.
The situation is a result of various causes. Yet, for you as a customer, it's important how we, as IndiGo, address this.
The reasons ranged from minor technical glitches to the weather to trouble adjusting its duty rosters to comply with the revised flight duty time limitations. There are two aspects to this: understanding FDTL and why it's so critical to airline safety, and understanding the timeline with which the revised FDTL norms were implemented in India. Flight duty time limitations are a prescriptive set of guidelines that define daily, weekly, monthly flight time, duty periods, and mandatory rest periods for pilots and cabin crew. The aim is to make sure that crew are well rested and physically and mentally capable of flying passengers safely. The Directorate General for Civil Aviation, or the DGCA, India's civil aviation watchdog, is responsible for overseeing the implementation of FDTL. Captain C.S. Randhawa is the president of the Federation of Indian Pilots, a non-trade union collective that aims to protect pilot rights and a key body behind getting the DGCA to implement revised civil aviation requirements that are on par with global standards, taking into account scientific studies on the subject.
This FDTL requirements are mandatory for pilots' rest, taking into consideration this is not other parts of work like any desk job.
After considerable pushback from the airlines, the revised FDTL was announced in January 2024 and then implemented in 2 stages, with some clauses coming into effect in July 2025 and the rest in November 2025. Effectively, airlines including IndiGo had well over a year to come to terms with these rules. And make no mistake, these rules really are important to airline safety.
This is a specialized job where the pilot needs to be totally alert, because anytime anything happens, and sometimes a fraction of a second, you have to take the decision. So it is very, very pertinent in the interest of the safety of the passengers that it is mandatory to adhere to these rules. If you do not adhere to these rules, even as a pilot, then the regulatory body takes action against you.
The revised FDTL norms included an increase in the mandatory rest period for pilots from 36 hours to 48 hours, a revised definition of night duty from midnight to 6 instead of midnight to 5, to include the window of circadian low, which is a period of time between 2 and 6 where concentration and focus is undeniably low. In addition, the number of landings during night duty is now limited to 2 as opposed to 6, and consecutive night duties are also restricted to 2 in a row. Thomas Friesacher, an aviation expert, crash site investigator, and former airline pilot, puts things into global context.
Firstly, I would like to say that fatigue is just not a sleepy feeling. It's a highly risk-critical thing in aviation. It is a clearly measurable degradation of reaction consistency, especially during the circadian low window.
What this means to airlines in India is that their existing pilots are available to them for shorter periods of time and need more rest in between. If they want to run to their full schedules, they need to hire more pilots, and this comes at a significant cost.
The key is the duty times are under regulation are the outer limits. You cannot schedule up to your most performance and high performance limits with your crews. This will not work. And when you're too close to the edge and you schedule too close to this maximum performance, a small disruption or disruption cascades like weather, when you have a sick period during the winter season, this will quickly end your operation.
We've already considered what led to IndiGo's rise, but market share and true profitability are different things. In the financial year that ended in March 2024, IndiGo recorded an annual profit of Rs 8,172 crore. That translated to nearly $1 billion at the time. Jagriti Chandra is the aviation correspondent at The Hindu, one of the oldest newspapers in India. She is someone who has observed the rise and fall of many Indian airlines over the course of her career.
IndiGo is hailed as a success story. It's running a profitable business, and profit margins are considered to be very thin in the aviation industry.
Let's take a look at the overheads Indian airlines typically face. Fuel accounts for nearly 40% of their expenditure and is paid for in US dollars, though ticket sales happen in Indian rupees. This is followed by flight equipment maintenance, depreciation and amortization, and user charges like airport costs. These costs are largely beyond an airline's control. While flight crew salaries make up a relatively small percentage of airline expenses, these expenses are set by the airline. Which means if they need to squeeze a resource, human personnel is a pretty safe bet. Running a lean operation helps save money. So the fewer pilots on staff and the more you utilize them, the better the balance sheets look.
It is well known in the industry that IndiGo does stretch its pilots to the maximum limits that are permitted under the law. And this is why the unions have been saying that these are generally prescriptive limits. And so it doesn't mean that if the rules say that you can utilize a pilot for 13 hours, you must very often make them work that long, but that's the upper limit. And that unions in Europe, etc., would be able to further negotiate their own airline schemes that don't require them to be pushed right up till the maximum limit under the regulators' guidelines.
But the way Indian aviation is currently structured points to an imbalance in power between the airlines, the regulatory body, the Ministry of Aviation, and the pilots. While IndiGo maintains that the flight cancellations were to do with planning gaps in hiring new crew to meet the revised FDTL norms, not everyone seems convinced, especially since smaller airlines ranging from Air India and SpiceJet to Akasa Air did manage to make the necessary arrangements. And in a bid to end the chaos at airports, though other airlines were made to adhere to the revised flight duty time limitations, IndiGo was granted an abeyance until February 2026.
Here government gave them a total dispensation. Now we have two sets of pilots in this country. They're all human beings, Indians. One set of pilots adhering to the regulation, they're getting more time off, they're getting more rest, they're more alert. And on the other hand, we have IndiGo pilots being subjected to extra working hours. What kind of regulation is that? You take the country to ransom by not employing pilots. And you don't want to implement the rules. So you take advantage and you arm twist the government and the people of the country. What a shame.
Enforcement and culture is not the right approach to it. It must be a non-punitive safety system. It was better 15 years ago when we had not so stringent regulations, but the airlines wouldn't schedule you in that intensity. Now everything goes into optimization, maximum. As I said, this are the maximum limits the legislation defines, but some operators think that's the target values.
While researching this piece, stories of how IndiGo treats its crew came up multiple times, of how pre-pandemic salaries weren't restored even when pilots began flying a full schedule, reports of how work culture changed gradually, and speaking up about issues like fatigue led to harsh treatment and vengeful roastering. The IndiGo pilots we reached out to were only willing to speak to us off the record. Most former IndiGo pilots, some of whom work at other airlines, in some cases in other parts of the world, weren't willing to go on the record either. They feared repercussions, like being failed in their medicals or facing complications in their license renewal in the future.
Pilots in our country are very scared because the moment you want to bring out anything wrong in the company, then they terminate you. What is happening is that there are only 4 airlines and their job opportunities are less, right? So pilots, they don't want to speak or go into other side of the curve and start reporting and lose their jobs. Because one airline fires, the other airline not ready to pick him up.
Captain Shakti Lumba, who has been outspoken about how IndiGo's focus on the bottom line led to a change in work culture within the organization, said this to Business Beyond.
IndiGo was no longer just a customer and employee-focused airline, but had morphed into a profit-generating corporate with total focus on the bottom line. The biggest sufferers of this management change were the pilots, whose salaries stagnated, allowances reduced, and utilization stretched to maximum legal duty hours, minimum legal rest. The result is an extra lean airline, dominating market share and generating profits at minimum cost.
We approached IndiGo for an interview and were told our request would be considered. Subsequent attempts to follow up went unanswered. But back to the pilots. Beyond the obvious, why pilots in India are so afraid to lose their jobs also comes down to numbers.
What is happening in India is that there isn't really a shortage of supply of pilots. If there is a market glut. And some people will say that this is a deliberate, like a structural issue that is being created so that you have a lot of excess people available who will then be there to work at airlines unquestioningly at whatever salaries that are being offered and under whatever circumstances. So this needs some attention.
Becoming a commercial pilot in India is prohibitively expensive. Industry estimates suggest that obtaining a commercial pilot's license and an aircraft type rating can cost up to around rupees 70 lakhs, approximately $75,000. Airline affiliated cadet programs are significantly more expensive. IndiGo's cadet pilot program reportedly costs around rupees 1.2 crore, roughly $130,000, while Air India's has been reported at around rupees 1.5 crore, roughly $160,000. And employment isn't guaranteed at the end of training. As a result, many pilots spend the early years of their careers paying off huge debts. Switching jobs within the industry is also complicated by long notice periods of up to 6 months and by employment bonds that in many cases tie pilots to airlines for several years. Pilots in India, it seems, have no choice. And this lack of choice extends to the paying public too. In the aftermath of the mass flight cancellations, IndiGo faced regulatory scrutiny from the DGCA and the Ministry of Civil Aviation. Following an official inquiry that found management and operational failures behind the flight disruptions, the airline was penalized rupees 22.2 crore, roughly $2.4 million, and placed under further DGCA monitoring. As of the 11th of February 2026, IndiGo is complying with the revised FDTL norms and has advertised job openings for new pilots on its website. But despite these measures, there's some damage that's been done that can't be undone. And the event brings to the forefront several questions. Like, is Indian aviation built purely for efficiency and not for resilience? And what happens when that efficiency is maximized to a point that it simply isn't sustainable? And who truly suffers the consequences of monopoly in a market?
This is the debate that has now been renewed because of the IndiGo crisis. Many talking about why the country needs more airlines and what needs to be done to make more airlines financially viable.
You need an overall change in the policy if you want monopoly to break. And monopolies should never be allowed, monopolies or duopolies in any corporate sector. Because then who will pay for it is the public.
The irony, though, is people who were affected by these flight disruptions, some of whom said they never wanted to fly IndiGo again, must contend with the fact that they don't have too many other viable alternatives, which really does mean that it's business as usual at airports across India right now. How sustainable that business is, though, remains to be seen. And the question remains, without genuine competition and meaningful slack in the system, could Indian aviation be headed for another disruption of this magnitude at some point in the future? That's all from this episode of Business Beyond. If you'd like more, I recommend checking out our Business Beyond playlist.